It's wonderful to be here for another one of our virtual events. The first thing I should say, besides the fact it's wonderful to see you, is the Institute is now open again. It has been since the 1st of September, although we thought it was just a little bit early to hold events at our place again. We are welcoming visitors to our collections on a single basis. So you just have to make an appointment with our archivist and you can come and start using our collections again. As indeed has our most distinguished speaker today done many times. Nick Stanley is a well-known writer on questions of indigeneity, museums and art, particularly Asmat art. And he's also worked extensively on looking at early ethnographic film through the collections of Lord Moyne, as many of you will know. And now we're here to celebrate his latest production. I've already apologized to Nick that I haven't yet seen a copy, being at home at the moment, but nevertheless, I'm looking forward greatly to learning more about it. And so I think it's probably best if we simply go straight to our speaker. We are absolutely delighted that we have his presence with us once more. So please go ahead, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I'm just going to turn this on. Great. Thank you very much indeed, David. Firstly, I'd like to thank the RAI and its virtual team for enabling me to engage with so many friends and colleagues here, and to you all across 4 continents for joining us today. This book has been supported by a most generous grant from the Julian Hans-Straussing Trust, and has been constantly supported by Listen Bolton, my host at the Department of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum, and edited expertly by Sarah Fawkes at BM Research Publications. The British Museum, the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, Cambridge, have all been most generous in making the collections and the images so readily available. I'd like to thank all the staff who've given me unstinting assistance. Similarly, I thank SOAS Special Collections and the Bodleian Special Collections. A full list of my personal acknowledgements to so many individuals is recorded in the book. Let me introduce the person I foreground in this presentation. Robert Henry, always R.H. Codrington, was born on the 15th of September 1830 and died on the 11th of September 1922, a few days short of his 92nd birthday. He was the son and grandson of Anglican clergymen. He went to Charterhouse School and Wadham College, Oxford, where he obtained his MA and was ordained. He joined the Melanesian mission in 1865 and spent the next 22 years on Norfolk Island and visiting the mission field, Central Southeast Solomon Islands, and the Banks Islands of northern Vanuatu. I'd just like to point out one particular island which is going to appear a lot in our story. If you look at the bottom right-hand side, you'll see a large island called Espiritu Santo, and above it you'll see Goa, and then you see a little island called Mota, and Mota is going to appear quite often in our discussions. Codrington was the headmaster of St. Barnabas College on Norfolk Island from 1871 to 1877. He was also the head of the mission. After retirement in 1893, he spent his last 29 years as a canon of Chichester Cathedral, working mostly, this is Norfolk Island, translating biblical texts in the Mota language. This all sounds a fairly humdrum, standard clerical biography, but as I will explain, it fails to reveal his anthropological achievements, amongst which must be mentioned in this context that he became a fellow of the Anthropological Institute in 1882 and served as a member of council from 1889 to 1892. Let me now pose a couple of questions. Firstly, why should we be interested in a distant figure from the past who died 100 years ago? And secondly, Why should the anthropological community take note of a missionary evidently involved, even if only by implication, in the British colonial project in the Western Pacific in the second half of the 19th century? This little monograph seeks to answer these questions somewhat elliptically, but I hope credibly. Before I start to explore his accomplishments, I need to alert you to the terms native and savages that Codrington employs regularly. As will become clear from the context, this does not imply that Codrington held a pejorative view of Melanesian people. Nevertheless, today, these are terms that still bring us up rather short. Codrington was a singular missionary. He did not hold a high opinion of most other missionaries, whom he felt were morally unfit, ignorant, or intellectually lazy. The major charge was that of willful ignorance. He wrote, "Few missionaries have time to make systematic inquiries. If they do, they're likely to make them too soon, and for the whole of their after career, make whatever they observe fit into the early scheme of their native religion. Besides, every one, missionary and visitor, carries with him some preconceived ideas. He expects to see idols, and he sees them. Images are labeled idols in the museums, whose makers carve them for amusement. A Solomon Islander fashions his head of his lime box stick into a grotesque figure, and it becomes the subject of a woodcut as a Solomon Island god." But for Codrington, it was a more fundamental problem. He wrote, "I have a very poor opinion of knowledge of missionaries, who I think know very little generally of what natives really believe." But not only missionaries were at fault. Other Europeans, traders, the military, administrators, all came fully armed with their own prejudices through which they interpreted the world around them. This list also included armchair anthropologists like John Lubbock. Codrington remarked, "The more I read of books, the less I believe their writers. But by comparison of mistakes and ignorance, one can get knowledge." Codrington seldom ventured into the realm of grand theory and had a healthy disregard for evolutionary theories of staged human development. He remained a stubborn empiricist. He was convinced that any relationship with Melanesian people must be based on an adequate knowledge of their belief systems and norms. He wrote, "It's become my purpose to set forth as much as possible what natives say about themselves, not what Europeans say about them. For this reason, though the results of my own personal observations are given, I've refrained from asking or recording the information which my colleagues in the mission would abundantly and willingly have imparted." Instead, Codrington sought reputable local informants for his book, The Melanesians, Studies in the Anthropology and Folklore. As he wrote, "I was able to go through the subjects which are treated in this book with native instructors from the Solomon Islands and the Northern New Hebrides, with Marsden Manikalaya from Isabel, Benjamin Belle from Florida, Joseph Wate from Sa, Walter Woza from Motlav, Arthur Arodolewari from Aurora, Louis Tariliu from Pentecost, Martin Tangabe from Leper Island, every one of them, in my opinion, a competent and trustworthy witness." But missing from this list was Codrington's principal informant. Codrington acknowledged, and I quote, "the very valuable assistance of a native who was a grown youth before his people had been at all affected by intercourse with Europeans or heard any Christian teaching. The Reverend George Sarawaya, the first and now for many years the leader of the native clergy of this group." Here's Codrington again. You see him with the group of scholars he's speaking about. And here again, you now see George Sarawaya with his family. For Codrington, the principal skill required of the missionary was an ability to listen to and observe people about their daily life, its sickness and health, both young and old, and especially the old. Again, I quote, "A missionary has his own difficulty in the fact that very much of his communication is with the young, who do not themselves know and understand very much of what their elders believe and practice. Converts are disposed to blacken generally and indiscriminately their own former state, and with the greatest zeal, the present practice of others. This attention to living people required a second skill, an ability to understand and employ not only the vocabulary and grammar, but also the metaphoric usages peculiar to every group. And that was precisely what most missionaries spectacularly failed to achieve. Codrington observed as time went on how, in a missionary agenda, listening and observing without prejudgment declined quite markedly as the century progressed. Missionization should, Codrington maintained, respect the people who are being addressed. The point, he says, with Melanesians was not to turn them into Englishmen, but to make them Christians, and as a first step, to convince them that in the sight of God who made them and redeemed them, Englishmen and Melanesians were alike equal. Codrington's humanism was sincere, albeit occasionally expressed rather clumsily, as in the following. The most wonderful thing about heathen savages is that they are so extremely like other people. When one gets used to the colour, which is certainly the best wear for the climate, it's absurd to see the exact likeness of people you see in everyday England. My particular old friend, if white, would keep a general store in the village and be a church warden. Elsewhere, he underlined the importance of indigenous knowledge. I think it's probable that most people are little aware with how much skill and care those whom we call savages carry on their cultivation. In the island of Mota, there are 80 varieties of cultivated yams, recognized and named. How many well-known varieties of bananas have their own names, I cannot tell, but a native knows them by the look of their stems and their leaves. What I find most interesting about Codrington's letters, his journals, and his publications is that European missionaries almost never appear in his narrative, which focuses exclusively on his Melanesian students and parishioners. Anthropology and theology were to have their separate boundaries that were seldom breached. This is not to infer that Codrington was uninvolved in missionary activity. As a linguist, he was the chief translator for the mission of the Bible and the other sacred texts. And on a day-to-day basis, he led the liturgy and prayers at St. Barnabas College. But Codrington was not only a teacher and preacher, he was also an avid and keen student to get to the real grasp of Melanesian life. When we consider the imperial context within which Codrington worked, it's clear that he recognized how the new political and economic interventions impacted on the Melanesian people he served. Although he acknowledged the British Navy provided missionaries with protection, he grumbled, "These little men of war go about to protect the traders and not the natives." The Navy's indiscriminate bombardment of coastal villages left Melanesians terrified and uncomprehending as to why they'd been so inexplicably assaulted. Traders, the chief culprit in Codrington's view, in turn responsible for despicable practices in labour recruitment. Europeans, he writes, have from the beginning of intercourse with the Melanesian natives kidnapped them and have persuaded themselves they were doing them a service by bringing them into what's called contact with civilization. The natives have from the very first resented the kidnapping of their sons, and their sons, however much they wish to go away and have rejoiced in what they've learned and acquired, will hardly be said by any impartial observer to have done any good when they returned. Ultimately, these recruitment practices were a threat to the very viability of the island communities themselves. Codrington wrote passionately, "The labour trade is the most serious obstacle in the way of evangelization of the natives. It's not a question of more or less difficulty in carrying on the mission. It's a question, in some islands already, whether the population is to be utterly destroyed instead of being evangelized." The consequences of this trade could be extremely poignant, as Codrington records in a late letter. "Salvi, the second great man of Boli, came off, as he'd promised, to bring me a present. It was an alarmingly large one, a pig. I gave him what I could, but he assured me he did not think of property or pigs, but only of one thing, that he might get back his boy who'd gone for labour. I never gave him credit for so much feeling, but he had tears in his eyes when he begged me to get his son back. It appears that the boy is in Samoa, and I don't know what I can do, but people fancy that we all belong to this place or the group of islands, and that I could go and see the boy and get him away. Codrington felt that there was something that people could do for themselves. Although his prescription looks rather feeble today, it was nevertheless quite radical in the 1870s, especially as he foresaw the end of missionary presence. And I quote, "These people, having no political organisation whatever, are in a hard case when the law of the bow and arrow are put down. I told them they must try and get a village council of elders into play. We've been accustomed to abhor the common assumptions of political power by missionaries, but we must keep in view the Melanesian political as well as spiritual advancement." Let me now turn to my second rhetorical question, relating to Codrington's collections, the issue in which the museologists amongst you are most interested. Before I start to address this topic, I beg your indulgence whilst I make a brief digression as a preamble to my answer. Very recently, Clive Gamble has published a splendid book entitled Making Deep History, Zeal, Perseverance, and the Revolution, at the Time Revolution of 1859, in which he identifies the role played by flint tools as a proxy for human activities in the dating of the prehistoric past. Digging through the various strata of deposits and discovering flint implements, archaeologists were in 1859 able to date the first and subsequent human signs of activity. This provided the revolution that entirely recast our understanding of human antiquity. Now, at this junction, Codrington, as he set out to join the Melanesian mission, was commissioned by a museum near to his family home, the Blackmore Museum in Salisbury, to make a collection. And he was advanced £100 to facilitate the task. Although Codrington, like his brothers Tom and Oliver, was already an interested antiquarian, yet he was probably unaware this museum was a living oxymoron, a very modern museum devoted to uncovering the deepest past through the assiduous collection of the most antique flints and flint chips. One of the directors of the museum, Edward Stevens, described its remit: to throw much light upon the progress of civilization in various countries, we seek to render it more illustrative and more generally representative of the industry of the Stone Age of various countries. In a rather strange sleight of hand, contemporary ethnographic objects in North America and elsewhere also found a place in the museum, with this justification. Implements, weapons, and ornaments of modern savages served to throw light upon the use of similar objects belonging to prehistoric times. As soon as Codrington reached Melanesia, he sought analogues for flints to send to the Blackmore Museum, but the best he could manage were clamshells and stones, which Melanesians used in axes and adzes. The first recorded items Codrington sent were 2 or 3 different bits of rock. Although regretted he was unable to supply fossils, he wrote, "Here I never heard of fossils, nor can I find anything myself. I suppose to send a bit of coral rubbish or whatever is hardly worthwhile." Next year he tried again, and he wrote, "I enclose in this a bit of flint or something used in the Solomon Islands for various purposes. You'll observe that it's a regular flint chip, but I suppose it's probably not flint at all." He appealed to Stevens for instructions for how to go up making a collection, but all he received was a copy of Stevens' Flint Chips, a guide to prehistoric archaeology at the Blackmore Museum, Salisbury. In deep frustration, he turned to Augustus Franks at the British Museum, but again, all he received was the handbook of the British Museum Ethnographic Collection. Both the Blackmore and the BM Codrington collections from 1873 to 1876 are heavily skewed towards these early implements. Codrington's contributions to both museums ended abruptly in 1876. So Codrington was left to his own devices, but quickly he formulated both a rationale and a method in his collecting. By the time he came to write the Melanesians, he had a fully fledged agenda, which was to study the arts, namely in which the culture of the people expresses itself, by which they build and decorate canoes and houses, plant and cultivate their gardens, furnish themselves with weapons and implements for war and work, catch fish, prepare their food, furnish themselves with clothing and ornaments, make and use money as a medium of exchange. He'd started to explore this wider agenda earlier. In 1873, he had donated to the British Museum a garment called a malo saru. His authority is immediately apparent as he describes the dress as beautifully made in coloured matting, the highest product of Banks Island's art, which was worn by certain persons at festive seasons only. It's really well made with a good design. He expands further on the accessions label. Dress used in dances. It is 4 scarf-like divisions united at the top with a band with an opening for the neck. It's made from narrow strips of buff-coloured vegetable fibre, fringes being left at the lower ends. The front of each lapel is covered with lozenge patterns in black and crimson, so interwoven they do not show at the back. The Malu Saru in the British Museum collection provided Codrington with the opportunity to explore how cultural objects and practices were both preserved and lost. Codrington was keenly aware of the relationship between material and intangible culture, and it's for this reason that he assiduously collected and documented what he termed folklore to set beside the objects. He wrote, "The value of truly native stories is beyond all question. They exhibit native life in the particular details which come out in the narrative." Codrington also felt the garment was an example of what he termed a survival reversed. This type of ceremonial garment had become obsolete, Codrington argued, not because European clothing had taken precedence, but, and I quote, "the men who've received the art from their ancestors have almost all died out, and the 2 that survive are too jealous to show any young men." Why would people who currently wear little, if any, clothes treasure such elaborate constructions? Because, Codrington argues, people go stark naked if they're rising into clothes. They would never begin with a very elaborate thing like this. Whereas if people were losing arts, these people are losing their arts, they would be rather more likely to give up common tapa or anything of that kind generally than rich and great garments to give up a mark of distinction. The Malu Saru dancing dress and the Tamate cloak that you see here and hat from the Banks Islands provide a vital link to local belief systems and rituals. The hats also provided a visual linkage between the past and the future, as Codrington reported. When white men were seen with hats, they were supposed by the natives to wear what corresponded to their own masks. The native name for a mask worn in one of these societies is the same as that given to the society itself, tamate, a ghost. And tamate has long been established as the name for any European hat or cap. When visiting Cambridge in 1908, Codrington noted a Malu Saru dress in the collection. He wrote to the director, von Hugel, "I enclose a photograph which I happened to come across last week. It'll do to put with the dress, to show how it appeared when worn. I remember it was considered rather a wonder that Bishop Selwyn could find it, and I was bound to find a properly initiated person to wear it for the photograph." This is but one example of the complex meanings that can accrue to objects and serves to emphasize Codrington's conviction that the material and mental worlds are intimately entwined and need to be studied together. Material artifacts were fundamental to the grounded understanding of Melanesian life and demanded their own respect. This, of course, puts him in a very different position to other anthropologists who at this time were starting to draw away from museums and from material culture. Codrington is closely associated with the development of the concept of mana in Melanesia. In his 1891, The Melanesians, he defined the term. It's a power of influence, not physical, in a way supernatural, but it shows itself in physical force, or in any kind of power or excellence which a man possesses. This manner is not fixed in anything and can be conveyed in almost anything. But spirits, whether disembodied souls or supernatural beings, have it and can impart it. And it essentially belongs to personal beings to originate it, though it may act through the medium of water or a stone or a bow. For Codrington, mana was a critical concept. On the one hand, it held spiritual power, but on the other, it was firmly rooted in empirical experimentation. He wrote, if a man finds a stone that has some special quality, and this is a mana stone from Mota, then he tests it to see if it works in terms of mana. He can be sure that if crops increase near the stone, then the stone is truly a charm and has efficacy. And here's another from Santa Cruz, another mana object. Similarly, magic objects can be used to harm adversaries. Codrington offers the example of poisoned arrows. And he writes, a bit of human bone, a fragment of coral, a splinter of wood, or of an arrow by which a man has died, is bound up with the leaves which have mana for the purpose, with the mana song. By this means, the power of the ghost is bound to the charm, and the talamatai is secretly planted along the path which the person at whom the charm is aimed must pass, so that the virtue of it may spring out and strike him with disease. And mana is very much alive today. In PNG in 1996, Sebastian Haraha relates how a man pursued by sorcerers seeking to obtain his magic charm offered the object to the PNG National Museum to be rid of the sorcery. And here you see this image. And similarly, at the start, as the late Lawrence Fuanatu recorded during the period of ethnic conflict in Solomon Islands in 2000, the insurgent Malaita Eagle Force overran a cultural center to seize a Moro figure, which you see here on the right, which they burnt to destroy its power. Codrington could be seen as an early advocate of the later celebrated W.I. and D.S. Thomas theorem. If men define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences. But Codrington's version was more radical. The spiritual becomes manifest in the material world. This spiritual aspect of ghostly power provides the opening for the transfer of mana to Christianity. But always the material world remains in sight. Codrington was at pains to convey the reality of what he's describing through illustrations. He was an accomplished draftsperson, working mainly in pen and ink, but also watercolor and occasionally through photography. This adds considerable authority to his prose, as seen particularly in the Melanesians. There are several topographical drawings like this. And again, I just ask you to look at the quality of his drawing. As you can see, cross-hatching and even pigs down at the very bottom there, looking rather like stones. Detailed sketches of items like canoe thwarts here for both holding the boat together and also for a rest for spears. And domestic houses, Wadori's house on Santa Cruz, and you could see he's rather poor at drawing people. He's much better at buildings. As well as arrows, adzes, and axes and fishing gear. Towards the end of the chapter on the arts of life, Codrington introduces decorative arts and ornamentation, be found on lime boxes, water bottles, ear ornaments, and even tattoos. These he particularly commends as both markers of individual island provenance, as well as a remarkable freedom of ornamentation. This work also gives a glimpse of his own collection that he maintained at St. Richard's Walk in Chichester. We get more insight through James Edge Partington's An Album of Weapons, Tools, Ornaments, Articles of Dress, etc. of 1890, where he devotes 11 plates to Codrington's personal collection that he, that's Edge Partington, drew in ink at St. Richard's Walk in Chichester. When Codrington's personal collection had finally all been shipped to the Pitt Rivers Museum, his house looked empty, and he felt keenly the absence of his cherished possessions. He also reflected on how his ministry had left few lasting traces. He wrote in 1919, in pain and distress, to his former fellow missionary, Charles Brooke, "We were good missionaries. We desired to know and live with the natives. I fear there's been in that respect a considerable deterioration in Norfolk Island and a change in the way of looking at the working of things." He continued, "The present conditions of the mission make me think that my little labours came to nothing." But he maintained his considerable correspondence with former students and other Melanesian colleagues in the language and motor to the end of his life. We now know, thanks to Thorgo Cautius's translation, how intimate and thoughtful these late contacts were. Codrington also had the very real satisfaction of having made a coherent collection that nourished his narrative of Melanesian anthropology. He could visit his acquisitions in Cambridge, in London, and Oxford. Indeed, you can see for yourself at the Pitt Rivers Museum, one of his objects, where this armlet is described, as you perhaps can just about see, written inside the ring, as an exceptionally fine example, demonstrating his authority and his judgment. Codrington remained an ardent and intelligent collector. In one of his last letters, he wrote to a young follower, "It's a singular thing that some people are born to collect something. Very often the passion goes off early. For my part, I think it's a very desirable appetite." And he concluded with a metaphor that we may find at the moment somewhat uncomfortable. There are people like you, and to a less extent like me, who infest museums and congregate in societies, and they naturally like to know one another. It's the most fortunate thing, I think, to be bitten by these microbes. A curator delights in a cadet, as a mosquito delights in a rosy sleeper. But we may reflect that as a result of Codrington's efforts, we now have a benchmark set of collections of real importance for the history and study of Melanesian culture today. But really, we owe R.H. Codrington much more than just a recognition of the significance of his collections. We should also note the persistence of his humanist anthropology that recognizes the status and achievements of Melanesian people demonstrated in his writings, and also his insistence on the importance of material culture in Pacific ethnography. In particular, his work on design, to be found at the Edda Melanesians, remains as fresh today as when first published 130 years ago. It demonstrates how artistic accomplishment is embedded in cultural practice, and indeed, how the decoration of much contemporary churches in Melanesia and other important buildings reflects this dazzling visual heritage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nick, for that absolutely fascinating presentation. I've got awful lot of questions, but let's go straight on to our two commentators, and then we can come back. So everybody, please do think what you would like to ask, and just basically you could already start pushing in your questions into the Q&A box. I mean, they're absolutely fascinating. And I would love to know more about the intellectual roots that Codrington felt that he'd come from, that suddenly turned him into an anthropologist. So, but look, let's move on to the commentator, and we're very, very pleased to welcome our long-standing colleague and friend to the Institute, Dr. Lysant Bolton, who is keeper at the British Museum. And Lysant, the floor is yours. Please do go ahead. It's very nice to see you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this, which I'm really delighted to do. Really pleased that Nick Stanley was willing to do this research, and really pleased really delighted by the research that he's done. And this book's titled Objects as Insights. And he's clearly shown us how much objects can provide insights. They provide a sort of point around which we can gather information into the collector and into those from whom they were collected. It's an obvious point, but a good one to make again. Objects are time travelers. They were there then, and they're here now. And that kind of point of connection, this kind of arrow of connection is quite, makes them quite powerful sometimes, I believe. They're evidence of past times, and they provide a direct connection to them. And they do that, obviously, especially for source communities, but they do it for all of us. And the history of their collection, of the way in which they collected, is a really important way in which to gather some of the information that they open the door to, in that sense. So the great value of the research such as Nick's undertaken for this publication is it brings information about the collection of those objects together, using them to provide a lens on those times and on the times since. So the Malo Saro, which is on the cover of this book and which Nick showed us a photograph of just a few moments ago, the plaited pandanus textile, is an example of that. Actually, I think it's banana fibre. I can't quite remember. Anyway, sorry, that's probably not important. It's a rare example of an important textile type from North Vanuatu. And that Codrington collected this is just terrific. It's a great thing. They were hardly being made even then. There is one in Basel, and also, as Nick's just mentioned, one in Cambridge, and the one in the British Museum. And perhaps there are others of which not known to me anyway. But they are extremely important and once you put them together with more recent anthropological descriptions and accounts of that part of Vanuatu, we know that they are markers of achieved status, of high status, very high. The analogy you might make is that they're a bit like the academic gown worn to receive a doctorate. By looking at them, anyone in the society would know that this is a very high-ranking person. And they're not the only markers. In fact, in the Banks Islands, where Mota is, many different objects marked status, even up until the sails of canoes. So the high-ranking men were allowed to dye their sails red, and an observer at the time described them as being like butterflies on the water. There's sort of red sails in the distance. But this status, this was a highly stratified society, stratified by achievement, not by inheritance, and one which was quite preoccupied with material culture in a sense, and especially in material culture as a marker of status. And that's quite interesting to compare that with the way in which that happens in our society, for that matter. But the Malo Saro also tells us about, by looking at it, it tells us something about the skills, about the aesthetics, about what is valued. Obviously, red feathers are valued right across the Pacific, and they're clearly valued here in the Banks Islands. The object tells us so much, and so when we put that together with what Codrington is able to tell us about how he collected in the broader context, the object becomes an insight into a whole lot of different aspects of life in the Banks Islands then. And then for people in the Banks Islands today, it provides an insight into their history, into what their society involves today. So I think that I just want to really congratulate Nick for this work of painstaking scholarship. And I want to say thank you for the way that this work enables us to stitch more information about this collection together with other sources, and to learn and value all the more the societies from which they derive. So thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asmat. That's extremely interesting. And now we have a second commentator, Sarah Folks. If Sarah could be brought to the table, that would be marvelous. And I see more questions are coming in. Please feel free to carry on sending them. Is Sarah here? Excellent. Excellent. Please just go ahead, Sarah.
Good afternoon. Sorry, a few technical glitches there. Well, thank you very much for letting me speak this afternoon. I can't really commentate with the same authority as Nick and listened, but I'm the series editor of the British Museum Research Publications, and it really is with great pleasure that we now publish Nick's book on Codrington. This is in fact the second book that I've worked on with Nick. The first was his book on Lord Moyne's expedition to South Papua. And whilst the protagonists of both books couldn't be more different in many respects, Nick uses these two figures as gateways to understanding really large and significant Melanesian collections, not just in the BM, but in other museums around the country. And as an editor, it can often be quite intimidating when an author approaches you with an idea to write a catalogue of a whole collection in the museum. And obviously this scholarship is to be applauded, but often it takes years to complete and then can sometimes lack a wider context that is increasingly needed. However, Nick's approach in both the books I've worked on has been really quite straightforward, but very effective. With both of the books, he starts with an individual and works from there. And this way, the objects are connected from the outset to the people who collected them, but most critically to the people who made them and wore them and used them. And it's this sort of scholarship that really furthers understanding of our collections and critical ways of talking about the objects in our care, exactly the sort of thing that listeners are talking about. Nick has rather modestly referred to both publications as his small little books on the subject. I keep saying to Nick, they're not small, they're selective. I think with both Moyne and Codrington, Nick could very easily have got sidetracked with lots of interesting but perhaps relevant biographical details of both of the people involved. Instead, he's stuck to what matters. He talks about their engagement with the objects, their motivations, the people they met, and how the objects came into the museum collections, and having to tackle aspects that don't sit very easily with us today, as Nick was talking about earlier. And it's this approach that makes these books so invaluable. They're very accessible in their size, but also in their language. Nick talks with authority, but not in jargon, and he's an editor's dream, really. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of the helpful people that Nick and I have encountered along the way. Nick already mentioned them, but I just would like to reiterate that. The Pitt Rivers Museum and the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge have supplied us with some wonderful high-res images, and it really is most appreciated. Thanks are also due to the British Museum's photographers and the collection managers. Stunning new photography of the objects donated to the museum by Codrington. And some of these artefacts have never appeared in publications before, so it really is with great pleasure that we can do so now with stunning photographs that really do capture the wonder of these objects. I'd also like to thank Julia and Hans Rousing for their extremely generous support of the publication. This has ensured that we can publish everything to the highest possible quality, and it's this kind of support that allows the British Museum to be able to upload free PDFs of our research publication series online. So within the next 6 months, a PDF of Nick's book will be appearing in our new digital publications repository for everyone to view and download. Will enable Nick's scholarship to be read all around the world for free wherever there is an internet connection, and ensure that it has a lasting legacy in the Melanesian community. I'd like to thank you, Nick, on a personal level for being such a pleasure to work with. You are always so modest, yet efficient and responsive to all of my nagging comments and suggestions. I just hope that we can find another subject for you to write. However, in the meantime, congratulations on writing an absolutely wonderful book that will be so invaluable. And thank you also to the RAI for allowing us an opportunity. And of course, be right if I didn't plug the book. I believe some details have been sent to the attendees, but the book can be ordered from the BM's website using a 10% discount code, I believe will be valid for the next 10 days. And I can put a link of it into the chat. But thank you very much, Nick. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And just to reiterate that the book is already very reasonably priced, by the way. As you see, Andre, our colleague, has just sent a link round. It's only £25 already, which for a book these days is really very good. And you can get 10% off that. Well, what could be better? And probably it might, I don't know, does it have to be put in the post, or can someone just go and pick it up now? Probably it has to be put in the post if they get the discount, doesn't it?
Yes, I believe it does. If you can either order it online, or you can, if people would prefer to pay over the phone, then they can email our customer services who can arrange for that, or perhaps even arrange to collect it in person. But unfortunately, I don't think anybody could go into the BM shop and buy a book with that discount, I'm afraid. But if there's any problems, do email the customer services, and they'd be very happy to help.
Well, there we are. Well, thank you very much, much indeed. I mean, I think this sort of research is terribly important, not only because it helps us to understand better the relationship between material culture and anthropology, which is something which has been, of course, coming gradually to the fore over many decades, but something which, nevertheless, we still need to carry on thinking about. But also, it helps us to understand so much more about the history of anthropology. It strikes me again and again just how Malinowski and of course his followers pulled off the confidence trick of managing to get people to believe that there was no anthropology before they came along, which of course was manifestly untrue. And yet somehow or other that conceit is still both believed and not believed by very, very many people. Well, it's wonderful that the sort of work that Nick is doing, and as well as that of, say, of Han Vermeulen and Federico de Grado, who are just about to publish a very important book on ethnographers before Malinowski. It helps us to put all this sort of stuff in its wider setting. And I was particularly engrossed to hear Nick's comments about the different people with whom Codrington was interacting, which I suppose brings me to my first question. I mean, Nick, so what were his intellectual inspirations then? I mean, was to be an anthropologist in this remarkably empirical way something he learnt at missionary college, or did he develop it through his private reading, or did he strike close friendships with someone, or does it come really from a profound philosophical position that took him to becoming a more practical researcher, or maybe all of these? What do you think?
Thanks, David, and thanks also to Liston and Sarah for the very, very kind words. I don't think he thought of himself as becoming an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. I think he started off as an antiquarian, and I think that's probably the key. I'd always thought of antiquarians as looking to the past, but in fact, it seems to me that the more I think about it, and certainly in terms of Codrington, it was very much how the past can lead into the future. So, for example, one of his requests of his brother was to send him a coin, a Roman coin, so that he could use it as part of instruction. You think, it's a rather odd thing to do. So there he is out in the middle of the Pacific asking for a Roman coin. But in fact, what he's trying to do is he's trying to show the interlinkage between the past, the present, and the future, and how they are all interdependent. So I think that his humanism was the essential basis which came out of his particular form of antiquarianism. Both his brothers were antiquarians as well. His one brother was the chief of roads for Ireland, and he wrote a book on Roman roads. And his other brother, Oliver, dealt with Muslim numismatics. So there's a kind of sense in which the whole of the family commitment is to bringing the past into the future. I think that the other probable point of pressure was really his horror at what was going on in the name of missionization. He really did feel very aggrieved and disturbed at the ways in which people brought with them out into the mission field all their prejudices. And I hope I haven't labored that too much in my presentation. But it was a very real sense. And in essence, what his real worry was at the end of his time was that, in fact, everything had slipped backwards. That by the beginning of the 20th century, and particularly up to the 1930s, the early commitment to indigenous clergy had almost evaporated. And we were left with European, Australian, and New Zealand missionaries, and the local clergy became very much more in the background. So I think all of those things, as they were, concatenated together. So I hope that's, if a rather mangled answer, but some sort of answer to your question, David.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Let's pass on to questions. But could you just remind us where he studied? Where did he take his?
Wadham College, Oxford.
Ah, it was from Oxford, not from Cambridge. That's interesting.
Yes.
Well, now we have a number of questions. If you would like to ask your question live, please put your hand up, and I think we will be able to facilitate that. Otherwise, we'll take them from the chat. But it's absolutely fine. If you we have a live person. Let's do the live ones first. It's always nice to see a live person. So please, Jeremy McClancy, you have your hand up. Please go ahead and ask your question live.
Hi there. Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
Hello, Jeremy, I can.
I don't know if you can see me. I think it's off. Anyway, very nice to see you again. Very interesting talk. But one thing I'm rather interested in at the moment is the connection between the development of the arts and crafts movement in the UK and then disseminated abroad, and British appreciation of non-Western art, especially non-Western art produced by non-courtly cultures, i.e., in other words, not Japan, China, and Mughal India. And I was wondering, especially given his clerical background and his ability to draw and so on, are you able to tell us anything about whether I mean, we presume, obviously, he knew about Ruskin and then about William Morris, but have you come across any examples of that knowledge in his correspondence?
No, not directly, I haven't. There is a sense in which he's almost self-taught in all his visual development. He learns, as it were, on the hoof, and he acquires only slowly an understanding of the complexities of design. The study of design comes very late for him in the 1880s and 1890s. His early work is altogether much more archaeological, and he slowly moves actually through his own work. One of the things he had to do was, when Bishop Patterson was killed, he had to set about creating a church on Norfolk Island, which was to be his testimony. And St. Barnabas Chapel was not just commissioned by Codrington, who actually dismissed the official architect, who was the man who designed the Houses of Parliament, in order to do it with one of his friends. But he also went about learning to carve. He carved the lectern. Some of the stones that came to build the church were missing, so he had to carve stones as well. And then he had to learn to make fabric and to adorn it as well. So he was very much self-learned, and he also developed an ability to make rings for weddings. So he was quite a sort of a visual polymorph, as well as being an early photographer, though photography was actually not quite as successful as his drawing and sketching. So the answer, I'm afraid, is rather disappointing. I don't think he was very aware of the developments domestically in Britain, and I don't think he actually paid much attention to them afterwards when he came back, I regret to say.
No, thank you. Great.
Well, thank you very much. And now we have a few textual questions, as it were. And Eve Haddo would like to ask, do you have any sense of contemporary community responses to the Codrington collections? For example, that on Mota. And indeed, is Codrington himself still a familiar figure locally in the way that the Reverend Fox might be regarded on Makura? Are there comparisons there?
Yes, thank you, Eve. Very much so, and is very much involved in issues around the history of the Anglican Communion in the Western Pacific. Apart from Bishop Patterson, he's probably the best known historical figure and is very much venerated today for his work and also for the amount of contact he kept with contemporary figures. And that, I think, has gone down through the generations. But a person who would be able to give you a much better idea of that is the contemporary student of Mota, is Torgeir Kolsches. And I'm sure if you contacted him, he'd be able to give you a lot more details of the current relationship between living people and the history of Codrington.
Well, actually, Torgeir is in the audience today. I don't know whether you would like to speak. If you would, please just put your hand up. But Torgeir actually has a reply in the chat and says that, there we are. Right, so please go ahead. Let's see whether we can enable you to speak. Can we bring Torgeir to the floor? He's vanished.
Can you hear me now?
Please go ahead. Please go. Good afternoon. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you. And thanks for a wonderful talk, Nick. And of course, for a lovely book. I mean, it reads so incredibly well. And as was pointed out earlier, it's just delightful to read such, well, so much insight in such unpretentious language. So it's really an achievement. I'm sorry, I was a bit too relaxed there, lying on my couch. I see. I responded to Eve's question earlier, and the reason why I'm so direct about Codrington's current status on Mota is that when I returned, when I went there first for my first field work in 1996, Codrington was not someone they were acquainted with. Few of the clergy had heard about him and heard his name mentioned, but most would refer to it would be Patterson all around, and the two were close associates. That might be the reason for it. But I also write and mention as a fun fact a fun fact for you, Nick, because just a few weeks ago, the Malusar was worn for the first time again on Mota since Codrington's days. They've reproduced it based on the images from the British Museum and from Codrington's own drawings. So that's talking about the value of ethnography. I mean, the ethnography has an afterlife, and this is definitely one of them. And of course, worn with great pride. So that's a lovely little tidbit for this particular occasion, I think. So, but Codrington now is because they've partly through me bringing copies of the Melanesians back to Mota, he is now very much established as the chronicler of ancient mortar customs. Rivers had that honor for some time, as some of you may know. Large portion of his history of Melanesian society was dedicated to mortar ethnography, but his work is quite, well, ethnographically shoddy, and it's because well, he had a tendency to let theory override the empirical matters, very much unlike Codrington. So the fact that Codrington is now becoming re-established as the foundation of Melanesian ethnography in this respect is very promising, I think, and that's part of what Nick's wonderful work is about to do, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. It's pointless being an ethnographer unless you know how to write about ethnography. It's amazing how often that lesson is forgotten today, and thank you for raising it. But I don't know, Nick, whether you want to make any comments about the rediscovery of Codrington that comes up here.
Well, there is the other little story, which Torga and I have both been dealing with, which is Kirk Huffman from the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, who felt that Codrington actually had betrayed the trust of the people he was with by revealing their secrets. And Huffman actually talks about his discussion with contemporary people who wanted to, as it were, protest about this incursion, as it were, on their culture. I don't think it bears much weight, really. And I think, as I have written, and as Thorge has written in my book, I think that Codrington was always respectful of local custom and local people, and that he was not, in fact, the betrayer of any secret knowledge.
Well, thank you very much. I see that someone else has their hand up, which is great. There is a question that came in actually earlier on from Clive Gamble, indeed a former president of our institute. So it's very nice to see you, Clive. I hope you're well. And he says that Codrington got nothing from Stevenson Franks. Did he ever contact Evans, however? Because by 1872, ancient stone implements had been published. So was there an Evans-Codrington link, do you think?
I'm afraid I'm not aware of any. No, I'm afraid not. I think he was so upset with the dissolution of the of the Salisbury Museum that he as it were changed his direction, and he actually, I think, really abandoned archaeological research in frustration because he wasn't able to get anywhere.
Well, yes, thank you. Yes, I'm also interested. I mean, Evans was an interesting man as well, and the whole Evans household as a kind of an intellectual base. I'm wondering whether it was always easy to create links with Evans, as it were. He might have been in some ways rather a forceful man. So there may have been some personality issues there as well, but I simply wouldn't know precisely. Well, let's have Brian MacDonald Milne's question, please. Please just go ahead if we can connect you.
I'm trying to make it happen. It's not.
Absolutely.
I'm clicking on it.
Technology can easily.
Let's see. Maybe we can at least.
I think it's working now.
Brian, you will still have to unmute.
Okay, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Nick.
Hi, Brian.
I have two contributions rather than a question. The first is to say that in Melanesia, very often naming is very important. And therefore, if you want to know how people are remembered, you can look round and see how many people are named after them. A very large number of people are named after Patterson. And one of the students that I taught in the Solomons, who came to the Theological College, he came to the Melanesian Brotherhood, was actually called Codrington Toleng Lenga, and he was from Pentecost. And I'm almost certain that as a result of he being ordained priest later, there will be other people named after Codrington because they will be named after him. That's the first thing I want to say. Incidentally, Brian is quite a common name in some parts because they name people after me, which was very kind of them. The other thing is the presentation of the book. I have recently been at 150th commemoration of the death of Bishop Patterson, which was held in Exeter Cathedral last Saturday. And the Reverend John Pind and I both had copies of the book. And I was manning a stall at which I was selling my most recent book called Seeking Peace in the Pacific, which specifically had to do with the anniversary of the death of Patterson, who is one of those being commemorated this year. And we are very interested to know that it's on sale, and we'll be commending the sale to people through the Melanesian mission, of which I am the archivist. So I thought others would like to know that it is being promoted because we feel it is a very valuable part of the history of the Melanesian mission, which is included in this book. And that has been my speciality in the past, Pacific Church history. So I'm very grateful to Nick, and I want him to know that we have already been promoting it through the festival, which was held in Exeter Cathedral and which very many people attended, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. So that means Codrington has been forgiven, I think, Nick. That sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yes. Thank you very much, Brian.
Now let's see if there are any more questions. Do feel free to put your hand up or to put in a question. Thank you very much for that comment. So Margaret Taylor has a comment here. As someone who worked in New Caledonia, I can tell you that many people criticized Père Dubois for naming his informants, the Kanaks seeing them as traitors, and that I support Kirk, whom I've met in his criticisms. Well, I don't know whether you would like to make that comment live at all. You're most welcome if you would. I mean, in essence, it's about the propriety of publishing, I think, isn't it, Nick? This question.
Yes. I think that the distinction is between publishing secret information and actually just giving details of the authority with which he worked. And my view is that he certainly wasn't working in New Caledonia. And I don't believe that by naming his authorities, he was in any way endangering themselves. But it's not an issue that I'm a specialist in. But I can't see how that criticism could really be sustained, at least currently.
Thank you. Did he write in general in any of the periodical literature, or did he confine himself to this main monograph?
No, he wrote widely, and he wrote in Man. He wrote for the RAI 3 articles. He wrote 3 books, and he wrote probably about 20 articles, and so he was well published throughout his life. But his writings were not about individuals, they're about practices and about anthropological anthropological considerations of belief systems, not in terms of individuals.
Yes, well, there's a comment from Terry Brown. Thank you very much. He says that Codrington is a very common name in the Solomons, and Codrington's Melanesians is often part of the Anglican Theological College's curriculum.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you very much indeed for that, Terry. Yes, yes, that's very reassuring to know that as well, yes.
I suppose if he's lasted so well, it means that the accuracy of his ethnography must be remarkable. He must have been one of those people that double-checked what they were doing and got other people to help him. Is that the impression you have as well?
Yes, I think that early quote I gave of his, where he spoke about learning what the local people said and believed, and not what others would wish to impart. He actually was very careful not to listen to received opinions. He wanted to get back down to individuals who he was working with, so that his informants were in fact students at his college who'd come from all the islands. That was the list I gave you there. And he would speak with them, and when they returned home, when he was on the boats with them going back, he would speak with them and with their families at home as well, so that he had a depth of understanding, not just, as it were, sitting in a school, but going back home to the islands with these individuals.
And which languages did he speak?
He spoke Mota, was the main language. He wasn't as proficient as Bishop Selwyn, who spoke supposedly languages all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand, up to the Solomons. But Mota was the principal language, and it was the one, of course, which was adopted by the mission as the lingua franca for the whole of the work of the mission, not just in religious texts, but the conduct of daily life as well.
What's absolutely fascinating, thinking about his publications, is if they were not taught in anthropological departments, where were they taught? And clearly we've learned that they've been absorbed into the Anglican curriculum. It's almost as if that specialists who work in Oceania have never forgotten him and carried on beavering away, referring to him, writing to him, even, however, whilst textbooks of anthropology are written, his name doesn't really appear prominently, if at all, as an anthropologist. And so we have a kind of a disjunction between the production of what we surely can call anthropological knowledge and between what's regarded as being the framework within which it is normally produced. Is that a fair assessment, do you think? Yes, and there's a particular reason for it, I think, or at least partial reason for it. And that is the way in which anthropology moved away from material culture, particularly from museology. So they left him kind of rather washed up. But also, there was at least one prominent anthropologist, Roger Keesing, who actually felt that Codrington had got things quite badly wrong, that he misunderstood the meaning of mana. And as a result, he felt that Codrington was badly wrong and had actually taken Melanesian anthropology off in the wrong direction. So that's quite a charge from quite a prominent
anthropologist. It's something which, again, Torgeir has written about very convincingly. And I, like him, feel that, in fact, Keesing was probably a little hot under the collar against missionaries for other reasons. And that if we look at Mana again rather more coolly, Codrington fares a lot better than Keesing suggests that he does.
And what about the people themselves when they read his work now? Do they find it acceptable as an account of their society?
I don't honestly know. All I can tell you is that the Governor General of Solvenas, who was also the Archbishop of Melanesia, who I met in London when he came for his accreditation, regarded himself as a student of Codrington's. So I think that he is well thought of, both in political and in theological circles.
Well, thank you. Well, does anybody else have a question they would like
David,
to ask?
there's a question in the chat that hasn't made it into the Q&A from Emily Hayes.
Right, let's see how we can get to it now then. So Emily, what is your question? Well, maybe Emily, you'd like to put your hand up. Yeah, why don't Emily just come to the screen? Good afternoon, Emily. Do feel free to ask your question.
She's not on the screen. I will simply copy and paste her. Oh no, I actually can't ask a question myself. So basically she says, hi there, thank you for a fabulous talk. Could you share a few more biographical details about Codrington? Had any tragedies befallen him or those close to him? What events or people might have inspired his value system and behavior in the field? What were his politics and what did he like to read?
Well, that's quite a large question, isn't it? Let me try and see if I can unpick it a bit. He did like to read other anthropologists. He didn't think much of a lot of them. John Lubbock was one in particular he had an aversion to, because he felt that anthropologists who sat at home, read books and read reports from the field and then spouted forth their own versions were not worth reading, really. So a lot of anthropologists actually bit the dust as far as I'm concerned. In terms of what he liked to read, he got a very Catholic lot of reading, really. He read a lot of theology and patristics in particular, and some of his later writing is really very dry. He gave a series of, I think it's 8 lectures over 8 years at Chichester Cathedral, often to an audience of 4 or 5 of hours lectures on the early church fathers. So there was that side to him. He didn't read much of popular literature. Did he have anything serious happen to him? Well, he had this terrible event with the death of Patterson, and he had to see, as head of the school, the ship coming back to Norfolk Island with its sail at half-mast to find that the head of mission had died and that he had to take it over for 8 years. So it did have a large effect on his life. But rather unlike a lot of the others who wrote about Bishop Patterson, often quite floridly, Codrington was practical to the point. What he did was he designed and constructed a church that was going to be his memorial. And that was something practical that he could do. And I think that epitomizes the difference between him and others. His empiricism was, as it were, rife. He was always waiting to see how in practice things could turn out. I'm sorry it's not a very full answer, but I need to think about that question a bit more.
Yes, I'm still fascinated to know what his early reading is. There must be something there that produces this kind of, well, maybe there isn't. Maybe he was just a typical county family that believed in getting on with things. So that's also perfectly possible. Tolga actually comes here to Codrington's support and says that the Kirk misses the mark, in my opinion. Codrington does not reveal secret knowledge in the Melanesians, quite unlike what Rivers did in the history of Melanesian society. So perhaps it's a case of partly also of mixed identification. Do you think that might be possible?
Yes, yes, I agree with him entirely. I think to deal with your nagging question at the back of your mind, I'm trying to think. I don't know what the syllabus was at Wadham College. I think it was largely theological, because in fact he had a fellowship from Wadham for the rest of his life, which enabled him to be financially independent throughout his life. I think that the antiquarianism was probably the basis for his further intellectual development. And he dealt with other missionaries who, and again, I'm grateful here to Nick Thomas for reminding me of this, that there was a coterie of about 4 missionaries, including someone called Reverend Gill, Lorimer Fyson, and George Brown, who all, as it were, constellated around each other and around academics at Oxford. So they were informants, but they also spoke with each other. So they created, as it were, an intellectual atmosphere that I think enabled them, as it were, to support each other in their work, particularly Lorimer Fyson and Codrington, as others have written about. I think that was a very fruitful relationship. Fyson was based in Fiji, and they regularly corresponded throughout the rest of their lives.
Well, thank you. Because the classical syllabus in Cambridge under Ridgway moved away from text towards material culture at the end of the 19th century, quite markedly, or before the end of the 19th century. So it would be fascinating to know what was happening at Wadham College. But it's wonderful to hear about the intellectual circles that he was moving in. And indeed, that emphasis on networks and interrelationships is perhaps a very, very nice way to end our own gathering today, as we're now out of time. Well, what can we say? We wish your book every success. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and comments. And I think perhaps just a round of applause for our author and speakers. Thank you to the commentators. And we perhaps just invite Hani now to close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming today. And we do hope you consider donating to the RAI or becoming a fellow if you aren't already. And we wish you a wonderful evening. And thanks again to Nick for your presentation today and for the book. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.